Why you must listen. Hi everybody, my name is Nora. Today we're going to talk about why you must listen. Let's get started. Identify objects around you in English. The first way to stop translating in your head is to identify the objects around you in your target language. So if you're studying English, that means you look at the objects around the room and look at the objects in your life. Don't think of them in your native language first. Think of them in your target language first. So, if I look around the room, I see a computer. I shouldn't say the word in my native language. I should think of it in my target language. So, start with the items and the situations in your everyday life. If I say computer in English, maybe I should say computa in Japanese. I should say not, I don't know, water in English. I should say omizu in Japanese. So start associating the words in your target language with your everyday life now. So if you're studying English, that means start getting familiar with the things in your everyday life in English. Repeat phrases you hear native speakers use. Tip number 2 is to repeat phrases that you hear native speakers use. So if you're watching this channel, for example, or you're watching a TV show or a movie, listen for the way that native speakers make those phrases. If you hear a phrase you have never heard before, or you hear an interesting combination of words, try to repeat them yourself. Don't just listen, try to say them yourself. If you're in a public space and it's difficult to do that, fine. Practice in a place where you feel more comfortable. Maybe if you have some private space to practice, just repeat them. Get your mouth used to saying the words the way that the native speakers do. So if you never actually say words, if you're only listening and you're not actually producing the language, it's kind of hard to practice and to really hone your pronunciation, to improve your pronunciation. So when you listen to native speakers, try to repeat after them. For example, if you're studying English, you can try to repeat after this video. You can repeat after the things I am saying because maybe I'm using an expression or a series of vocabulary words together the way a native speaker would. It might be a good idea to try to practice the ways that native speakers put their words together. Try to repeat after native speakers, especially when you're looking at media. You can do this when you're reading books, too. You can try to read out loud interesting lines of books that you find, or something that maybe is difficult for you. This is a very nice practice tip. Make a situation where you can't escape into your native language. Make a situation where you can't escape into your native language. This essentially means immersing yourself. Of course, going to that country or going to a place where you can speak only in your target language is very difficult for some, totally understandable. But if in your life you can create a situation in your library, in your room, in your house, or somewhere for just an hour, I don't know, maybe a day, if you can create a situation or an environment where you have no choice but to use that language and you cannot escape, meaning that you can't go back to using your native language as a crutch or at all, it forces you to use the language you're studying. If you are lucky enough to live in the country or the place where you speak the language that you're studying, great. But you have to go out and interact with people. You have to put yourself in a place where you have no choice but to speak. It's very hard and it's very scary and embarrassing at first. But if you take time to find places and to make environments that are comfortable for you, where you feel comfortable making mistakes and asking questions, it's very valuable for your learning process. This is actually something that I did. My Japanese wasn't very good for a long time, but then I started making friends who could not speak English. I did this just through finding hobbies. There was a hobby that I had, I joined a group, and I actually joined a school where I could learn how to do that hobby, and everything was taught only in Japanese. And the people in my class mostly spoke Japanese. Maybe we would go out for drinks and food late at night or on the weekends, and everybody only spoke Japanese. And if I couldn't communicate, even in simple Japanese, I had no hope of keeping that friendship together. So it forced me to study. It forced me to think about the words they were using and try to learn those words and patterns, as well as how to produce them naturally myself. I was learning the vocabulary words the people around me were using and learning how to apply them on my own. That was only possible because I had no escape in those situations. Try to do that, even if you do it by yourself in your house. It's super helpful. Watch TV and movies in your target language without subtitles. Tip number 4 is to watch TV and movies in your target language without subtitles. I think that watching with subtitles can be very beneficial. If you're watching something or you want to watch something with titles on, great. But I sometimes find that I can, in my case, think too much about reading the subtitles and forget to listen. Maybe if you've seen a movie in your target language a few times with the subtitles on, try turning them off and think about the character's body language and the words they're using. You can always look that up later. Look up the words you don't know in a dictionary. But try to do it where you're completely focusing on the way that people are using their words, without subtitles. Kind of play around with it a little bit. If there's a word that's difficult for you to hear, you can turn on the subtitles in the native language of the movie as well. That's something that I've done when I wanted to study Japanese. It's very useful when the actual words spoken in Japanese appear on the screen. Sometimes it's easier for me to catch a word if I see it visually and I hear it at the same time. Another way to explore how you can use TV and movies is to turn on the closed caption so the words appear on the screen in the native language of the movie. This is sort of 2 points in one. Point number 1, watch movies without subtitles in your native language. And point 2 is to watch movies with closed captioning on, but in your target language, not in your native language. So you can try those 2 things with TV and with movies. Don't bring a dictionary to your lesson. Tip number 5 is don't bring a dictionary to your lesson. Okay, so give me a second here. I understand that dictionaries, especially electronic ones, are very convenient and we all have them on our phones now. Of course, it's important to use them and they're a great resource to have. However, one thing that really bothers me and I think is detrimental and not helpful for students is when students in a lesson are practicing conversation and they reach a point in the conversation where they don't know the word that they want to use. They know it in their native language and they don't know how to say it in their target language. So they pull out the dictionary. They say to the person listening to them, their practice partner, in their lesson where they have a limited period of time, just a moment, and then they look it up on their phone. It takes time. The flow of the conversation stops and then they say a word. It's like, whoa, no, you don't have that ability. You don't have the ability to do that in conversation with a native speaker. Most people, like if you go to a bank and try to open an account, are not going to pull out a dictionary and sit there and try to communicate as you look up each word. Or if you do, that's not a real conversation. So instead, try using a different strategy. By that, I mean if you find a word you don't know in conversation, explain the word to your conversation partner. Maybe they know the word. If you're speaking with a native speaker, this is a chance for them to teach you a word. I find that when people take the time to teach me a word, I remember the word much better than just looking it up on my dictionary. So try to resist this. Maybe you can bring a dictionary to your lesson, but try not to use it in conversation practice. It destroys the flow of the conversation. Instead, practice the skill of describing the vocabulary word you want to use and learn how to ask the meaning of a word. You can use an expression like, what's that word that means blah, blah, blah? Or, it's this thing that does this and this. This is an opportunity for you to describe characteristics of something in a different way. You can use body language. You have a lot of tools, but try not to use a dictionary in a conversation because it's not realistic. Train responses to common questions. Number 6 is a quick one. This is to train responses to common questions. For example, a very common question in English is, "Hey, how are you?" You should know how to answer this question. Just have a default response. "Hey, how are you?" "I'm good." If it takes you a long time to answer the question, "Hey, how are you?" you need to practice. I think that's a pretty good indicator. For example, sometimes I ask students a question they haven't quite gotten the idea of how to respond to yet, and they're not quick at responding. I say, "Hey, how are you?" and they say yes. And then they think and say, "I'm good." That's a very common question. So think about having a default response that you can just spit out. and that you can quickly say. If it's, "How was your weekend?" or "Hey, what's up?" or "What do you want to do for dinner tonight?" Think about just a handful, just a few responses to those questions, and train them in your mind quickly. How are you? I'm good. I'm okay. Not bad. Those are 3. It's about training responses to those questions, so there's no reason to be surprised by a question like, "How are you?" which is very common. For common questions, train yourself to remember responses. We've got a bunch of videos, especially beginner-level videos, for some example responses you can use. Don't get stuck with these little questions. Just remember a few responses. Practice them till they feel natural to you. It will save you time, and it will help the person asking the question to move forward in the conversation. Study with materials that don't provide a translation. The next tip is to study with materials that don't provide a translation. By this, I mean that if you're using worksheets or some kind of textbook and it has your target language, the language you're studying, with your native language next to it, while this can be useful, I feel that if you can, study your materials only in your target language and have simplified explanations for more detailed points in your target language as well. I don't want to say you should only study things in your target language and nothing from your native language, because of course it can be helpful sometimes to look up a word or to understand the grammar point in your native language. But where possible, if you can find something that provides a simplified explanation in your target language, it can be really, really helpful because again, you're learning to think on a simpler and more basic level about the language you're studying in that language. This can be really, really helpful. Find some materials to use that don't provide a translation. Maybe you can practice with books and written materials, but also video materials as well. There are a variety of different ways that you can find materials in your target language, like TV and on the internet. These are some things to think about, such as the level of vocabulary words people are using in the media content you're watching, who the media content is intended for, if it's children, young adults, or adults, the speed at which the speaker is talking as well. For example, I have the ability to change the level of difficulty of videos based on the rate of speech, the vocabulary words that I use, and how many idioms I use. I could make a video very difficult. We could make a very difficult video series by leveling up our vocabulary use or by speaking very quickly. Or, as you might see in our English in 3 Minutes series, we can also use very simple vocabulary and speak at a low rate of speech. This is a very intermediate level video. So look not just for written materials, but also for audio and visual materials. Think about who your audience is, the level of the material, and so on. It can be really fun and helpful to think about your target language in your target language. All right, we're almost done. Study phrases in addition to individual vocabulary words. The next tip is to study phrases in addition to individual vocabulary words. So yes, of course, vocabulary is important, but I personally find it very useful to look at how a vocabulary word is used in a phrase, because sometimes using it in a phrase helps you understand the nuance of that vocabulary word well. For example, a word like crazy in English. Depending on the situation where the word crazy is used, it could mean something different. It could mean a person who is confused or mixed up. It could also mean something really good. It could mean something very bad as well. If we look at the word crazy, it's quite difficult to understand the meaning of the word until you look at how it is used in a phrase so that you can get more information. So take a look at the way people use words and phrases, not just a single vocabulary word. You can learn a lot more that way. Do your daily activities in English where possible. The next tip is to do your daily activities in your target language. If you're studying English, that means try to do some daily activities in English. This could be very, very boring stuff, but just think about it when you're doing the activity. For example, right now, I am filming a video for interesting stories for English fluency. I could say something like, I'm going to work, I'm cooking breakfast, I'm doing the laundry, what do I have to do tomorrow? Try thinking about your everyday life in English if you're studying English. Try thinking about your everyday activities, the people that you meet, what you're doing. This can help you practice your verbs. If you're doing something at work, try to describe what you're doing. For example, I want to blank a picture. What's that word? You can check a dictionary at that point and say, oh, it's draw. I need to use the verb draw for drawing a picture. You can find these little gaps in your everyday life, little gaps in your knowledge when you think about your everyday activities in your target language. If you don't think about it in your target language, you might not realize you have vocabulary gaps or phrase gaps here and there. So this is a very good and kind of funny way to study. Use a learner's dictionary for new words. The last tip is to use a learner's dictionary for new words. In English, there are learner's dictionaries available. If you find a word that you don't recognize, you can check it in a learner's dictionary and it gives you a simplified explanation of the word in English. Instead of checking it in your native language, check it in your target language. Again, this helps you to understand the word that you're focused on, but from the language that you're studying, not in your native language. Using a learner's dictionary can be very useful. All right, so those are 10 tips to help you stop translating in your head. I know it can be difficult and it takes time and practice, but I hope that these are a few strategies that can help you as you study any language. Of course, this is an English language channel, but I think these tips are pretty good for learning just about any language. I really hope these are useful for you. If you have tried these strategies or if you have any other comments or tips, please let us know in the comments section below this video. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Interesting Stories for English Fluency, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!